Chapter 1. The Empty Carriage. There is a particular quality to fog in October that the villagers of St. Mary Mellow had long since stopped remarking upon, so familiar had it become. A fog that did not so much fall as arrive, settling over the water meadows with the unhurried confidence of something that had done this every autumn since before any of them were born, curling along the hedgerows and softening the church spire until it seemed less a building than a suggestion of one. It was into this fog, at 17 minutes past 6, that Miss Jane Marple stepped from her cottage gate on Church Lane, drawing her woolen shawl a little closer, and made her way toward the station to collect a parcel of knitting wool she had been promised by the carrier since Tuesday. She was not thinking at that moment of murder. She was thinking, if anything, of the curious dampness that had gotten into her delphiniums, and whether Dr. Haydock's advice about bone meal had been sound or merely kindly meant. It was this ordinariness, this profound, unremarkable Tuesdayness of the evening that she would remember afterward with a kind of retrospective vertigo, the way one remembers the last ordinary moment before a doctor's bad news. The station itself, when she reached it, wore its usual evening face, the oil lamps not yet lit, but soon to be. Old Ted Gubbins, the porter, stamping his feet against the cold on the platform, the smell of coal smoke and wet stone that had not changed, she supposed, since the line was built. She took her place on the bench beneath the notice board. Warning, do not alight whilst the train is in motion, a phrase she had read perhaps 400 times without once considering its darker possibilities, and waited, as the village had waited every evening for decades, for the 6:40 to come rattling in from Milchester. It arrived on time. That, too, she would remember, the terrible, ordinary punctuality of it. The great iron body sliding along the platform with its usual protesting sigh of brakes, its windows glowing amber against the deepening blue of the evening, each compartment lit like a small stage awaiting its actors. And for a moment, nothing seemed amiss at all. The guard swung down with his lamp. 2 farm women descended with baskets. A schoolboy leapt out whistling. It was, in every visible particular, a train arriving precisely as 10,000 trains had arrived before it. It was Ted Gubbins who noticed first, not through any great perceptiveness, but through the simple mechanical fact of his duty, which was to check the first-class compartment for Mr. Price, who took that train every Thursday evening without fail, as he had done for 11 years, ever since his retirement from Price. Ainsley and Whitmore had left him with nothing better to do than visit his sister in Milchester, and return promptly at 6:40, smelling faintly of her sherry. Ted opened the door of compartment 4C with the easy familiarity of long habit, and stopped. The compartment was empty, not merely unoccupied, arranged in a way that struck Miss Marple, watching from the bench with the sharpening attention of a woman who had spent a lifetime noticing what other people overlooked, as somehow more disturbing than disorder would have been. A cup of tea sat on the small fold-down table, gone quite cold. A thin skin formed upon its surface, exactly 2/3 full, the amount, she thought, that a man drinks when he is interrupted rather than when he simply finishes. Mr. Price's leather dispatch case sat upright on the seat, precisely where a careful man would place it. His newspaper lay folded to the crossword, 3 clues completed in his small, exact hand. And on the floor, half beneath the seat, as though it had slipped from a lap in a moment of sudden movement, lay a single lady's glove, pale kid leather, old-fashioned in its cut, the kind no young woman would choose today, carrying with it, when Miss Marple bent, with Ted's flustered permission, to look more closely, the faint, unmistakable ghost of lavender water. The station master was summoned. Then, with increasing agitation, the guard who had walked the length of the train not 40 minutes before at Milchester and would absolutely swear, that Mr. Price had been sitting quietly in that very compartment, umbrella across his knees, spectacles catching the lamplight, entirely and unremarkably himself. The doors, all of them, had been locked from the outside at every stop, as was standard practice on that stretch of line. The train had not stopped between Milchester and St. Mary Mellow, or so it was believed, and yet Edmund Price, solicitor, widower, benefactor of the church roof fund, was nowhere upon it. It was Miss Marple, moving with the unhurried, faintly apologetic manner of an elderly lady who does not wish to be any trouble, and is therefore permitted to go nearly anywhere, who crouched at last beside the open field-side door, where the fog was thickest and the platform lamps did not quite reach, and noticed, on the iron step below the frame, a single smear of dark, unmistakably muddy water, the particular ochre-brown mud she knew at once, having walked past it 1,000 times, of the old mill pond footpath. The door, she was quite certain, had been locked the entire journey. She said nothing to Ted. She only looked at the smear for a long moment, and then up into the gathering dark toward the direction of the pond, with an expression that those who knew her well would have recognized, though no one, that evening, was watching closely enough to see it. Chapter 2. A Solicitor's Habits. By morning, the news had traveled through St. Mary Mellow with the peculiar swiftness of village catastrophe, not shouted from doorsteps, for that was not the village way, but passed in lowered voices over garden walls, exchanged between the baker's wife and the woman who did the church flowers, carried along with the milk and the post until by 9 o'clock there was scarcely a soul in the parish who did not know that Mr. Edmund Price had vanished from a locked train, and that no one, not Ted Gubbins, not the guard, not the station master who had gone quite pale and kept repeating that he had never in 31 years, could account for how. Miss Marple, who made it her custom never to hurry toward gossip, but rather to let it arrive at her own doorstep in its own time, none the less found herself by 10:30 taking tea with Mrs. Thorne, the vicar's wife, in the small chintz-crowded sitting-room of the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the arrangements for the harvest festival, and in fact to listen. He was not a man one warmed to, Mrs. Thorne said, pouring with the slightly too vigorous energy of a woman who has been waiting all morning to say precisely this, to precisely the right listener. I don't say that unkindly, Miss Marple, only precise. You know the sort. He'd correct you on the spelling of your own name if he thought you'd got it wrong. Frightfully generous to the church roof, mind, but there was always a ledger quality to his kindness, if you understand me, as though every good deed were entered somewhere and might one day be called in. A man who kept accounts, Miss Marple murmured, and found the phrase settling into her mind with more weight than she had intended it to carry. Just so. And do you know, he had the oddest habit, Colonel Thorne mentioned it to me only last month, of asking after old families. Not in a friendly way, in a checking sort of way. He asked the sexton, of all people, whether the Fenwick plot was still being tended. Now, why would a solicitor concern himself with a grave that's been cold these 20 years? The name fell into the quiet room like a stone into still water, and Miss Marple, who had learned long ago the discipline of receiving such stones without visible ripple, merely inclined her head and said that she really couldn't imagine. And might she trouble Mrs. Thorne for the receipt for that excellent seed cake? But she left the vicarage some 20 minutes later with the name Fenwick lodged in her mind like a burr caught in wool, old, half forgotten, and yet she found not forgotten at all, not really, only folded away in that deep drawer of memory where the village kept its unhealed things. Inspector Craddock arrived from Milchester shortly after noon, and Miss Marple watched him with the particular fond exasperation she reserved for clever young men who had not yet learned that cleverness was the least useful of the detective virtues, set up his inquiries with brisk efficiency in the small back room of the Blue Boar. He interviewed Ted Gubbins, the guard, the station master, each in turn, and came away, she gathered from Constable Palk, with a great deal of technical certainty about locked doors and signal timings, and rather less patience for what he called, dismissively, the village atmosphere. It's a straightforward matter of mechanics, Miss Marple, he told her, when he called at her cottage that afternoon out of the courtesy he had learned, over several prior cases, not to withhold from her entirely. A man doesn't vanish from a moving train by magic. There'll be some perfectly ordinary explanation. He stepped off before Milchester, perhaps, and the guard's mistaken about the time. People's memories are unreliable things. Oh, entirely, Miss Marple agreed, pouring him a cup of tea he had not quite wanted, but felt unable to refuse. Though I have generally found, Inspector, that when a great many ordinary people are unreliable in exactly the same particular way, it is worth asking oneself why. Mr. Price, from everything I am told, was not a man given to sudden changes of plan. He took the 640 for 11 years. A creature of habit does not, on a whim, step off into a fog and leave his tea 2/3 finished and his newspaper folded to the crossword. Craddock had the grace, at least, to look thoughtful before he took his leave, promising to organize a search of the fields between Milchester and the village should Mr. Price not turn up of his own accord by evening. He did not turn up. The search began at dusk the following day, with lanterns and dogs and the grim, methodical thoroughness of men who did not yet know whether they were searching for a lost man or something considerably worse, moving in a slow line through the wet grass of the water meadows, along the old footpath that ran, as Miss Marple well knew, from the disused signal box near Cardew Cutting down to the mill pond and the willows that had stood weeping over its dark water, since before she'd first come to the village as a bride. It was young Willikins, one of the farm lads pressed into service for the search, who found it. Not the man, but his stick, Edmund Price's silver-topped walking stick, engraved with his initials, the wood dark and gleaming with the day's damp, standing propped with peculiar neatness against the trunk of the largest willow, not fallen, not dropped, not flung aside in panic or struggle, but placed, as a man places an umbrella in a stand, before sitting down to something that requires both his hands. Miss Marple, who had walked down with the vicar under the pretense of being useful with the flasks of tea, stood very still at the edge of the search party's lantern light and looked at that stick for a long moment, feeling the cold of the evening settle into her in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. A man who has fallen or fled or been taken by force does not pause to lean his walking stick tidily against a tree. A man does that only when he believes, however wrongly, however tragically, that he is about to sit down for a moment's quiet conversation and expects, quite reasonably, to be picking the stick up again shortly afterward. Chapter 3. The Body in the Reeds. They found him at first light, when the fog had thinned to a pale, shivering gauze over the water, and the search party, weary and silent after a night of fruitless quartering the fields, had narrowed at last upon the mill pond itself, that black, reed-fringed water that had lain at the edge of the village for as long as anyone could remember, ornamental once, in some more prosperous century, and now merely present, the way a scar is present, noticed only when the light fell upon it in a certain way. It was one of the dogs that found him, straining suddenly at its lead toward the shallows on the eastern bank, where the reeds grew thickest and the bank shelved away into water the color of strong tea. Edmund Price lay face down among them, his good overcoat sodden and dark, one arm flung outward as though reaching for something just beyond his grasp. His spectacles, Miss Marple noted this with the particular attentiveness she brought to such details, standing well back at the vicar's insistence but missing nothing for all that, still perched, extraordinarily, upon his nose, as though the water had claimed him too swiftly and too completely for even so small a thing to be dislodged. Dr. Haydock, summoned before the police surgeon could make the journey from Milchester, knelt in the wet grass with the brisk, unsentimental competence of 40 years' country practice, and pronounced, after a brief examination, what everyone had already silently concluded, drowned, and not so very long ago, a matter of a day, perhaps a little more, which placed his death, Miss Marple calculated with quiet and unwelcome precision, within hours of his vanishing from the train. Face down in shallow water, Haydock said, straightening with a grimace for his knees, addressing Craddock in the flat, clinical tone doctors use to keep grief at arm's length. No obvious wounds. Could be a fall, could be a faint, could be— He did not finish the sentence, and did not need to. It was the vicar's wife, arriving breathless and pale with a flask of brandy no one had thought to ask for, who said what half the village was already thinking and had not yet dared to say aloud. The mill pond. Of all places, it's where poor Alice Fenwick went in, all those years ago. Don't you remember, Miss Marple? You must remember. It was before my time here. But surely, she did remember. She remembered it with the sudden, vertiginous clarity of a photograph turned face up after years in a drawer. Alice Fenwick, 22 years old, dark-haired, quick to laugh, taken into the Price household as governess to old Mrs. Price's grandchildren in the last years before the war, and dismissed within the 12-month, under circumstances the village had discussed in whispers, and then, with the peculiar collective discipline of English village life, had agreed never to discuss again. She remembered the inquest. Perfunctory, swift, misadventure the verdict, delivered with the particular haste of a coroner, eager to spare a respectable family further embarrassment. She remembered, too, though she had not thought of it in years, the young solicitor's clerk who had attended that inquest on behalf of the family, sitting very upright and very still at the back of the room, a slim folder of papers upon his knee. Edmund Price, not yet 30, already possessed of that particular quality of controlled, watchful correctness that would define him for the rest of his life. Craddock, predictably, waved the connection away with the brisk impatience of a man who did not care for coincidences that complicated an already inconvenient case. A pond's a pond, Miss Marple. There's not so very many bodies of water in the parish for a man to drown in, if drown he did. I shouldn't read a great deal into the geography. No, Miss Marple agreed mildly, watching the men lift the sodden weight of Edmund Price onto a stretcher with the careful, awkward tenderness men reserve for the dead. I dare say you're quite right, Inspector. It is, after all, only a pond. But she did not believe it, not for a moment, and she rather suspected, from the faint, unreadable tightening about his eyes, that Craddock did not entirely believe it either, whatever briskness he chose to wear for the benefit of the search party. She walked home alone that morning, declining the vicar's offer of his arm, wanting the solitude of the lane and the slow private work of memory. And it was there, somewhere between the lich gate and her own garden wall, with the frost still silvering the hedges and the church bell tolling the half-hour with its familiar, indifferent patience, that the full weight of what she was beginning to understand settled upon her. Alice Fenwick had died in that pond 22 years ago, and the village, kind, gossiping, forgetful St. Mary Mellow, had folded her away into its collective memory as one folds away a garment one does not wish to be reminded of, not destroyed, only put out of sight, in a drawer no one opened. There had been an inquest, there had been a verdict, there had been, she now recalled with a small, cold clarity, no family left to mourn her publicly, an elderly aunt in Milchester who had since died herself, no husband, no known child, or none that the village had ever been permitted to learn of. Miss Marple stopped quite still in the lane, one gloved hand resting upon the cold stone of her own gate, and felt the peculiar, solemn weight of a realization settling over her like the fog that had not yet fully lifted from the fields. She understood with sudden and absolute certainty, very likely the only person left in St. Mary Mellow who still remembered Alice Fenwick's name at all. The only one who had sat, all those years ago, in that same hushed coroner's court, and thought, with the discomfort of a young woman not yet old enough to trust her own instincts, that something about the swiftness of the verdict, the closed and careful faces of the Price family, the convenience of it all, had not sat easily with her. And now Edmund Price, who had sat at the back of that very inquest with his folder of papers and his watchful, correct silence, lay drowned in the very same water, 22 years later, almost, she thought, and the thought arrived with the quiet, terrible weight of certainty, almost as though something long buried had, at last, and by some patient and deliberate hand, been permitted to rise. Chapter 4. Old Wounds, New Faces. The churchyard of St. Mary Mellow lay quiet under a sky the color of pewter, its gravestones leaning at the companionable, weathered angles of old friends who have stood together too long to trouble any longer with formality. And it was here, on the afternoon following the discovery of Edmund Price's body, that Miss Marple came, ostensibly to see about the harvest festival flowers, and in truth to find old Amos Trewin, who had been sexton of that parish for the better part of 40 years, and had buried, by his own reckoning, very nearly everyone worth burying. She found him where she had expected to find him, in the far corner beneath the yew trees, where the older graves stood, moss-blurred, their inscriptions softened by decades of rain, and where he was engaged, with the slow, devoted patience of a man performing a private ritual, in clearing autumn leaves from a modest headstone that Miss Marple, drawing nearer, recognized with a small, quiet catch of feeling. Alice Mary Fenwick, 1908 to 1930. At rest, no mention of family, no verse, no tender remembrance such as the neighboring stones carried in loving abundance, only the bare, cold facts of a life and its ending. "You keep this one tidy, Amos," Miss Marple observed, settling herself, with his assistance, upon the low stone wall nearby. "Though I don't recall anyone in the village asking you to." Amos straightened slowly, his old joints protesting, and looked down at the grave with an expression she found unexpectedly moving, not the professional solemnity of a man accustomed to death, but something gentler, almost paternal. No one ever did ask, Miss Marple, not in 22 years. Poor lamb had no one left to ask on her behalf, once her aunt passed, but I remember her, you see, sweet-natured girl, for all the trouble that came to her, used to bring me primroses for my Nellie's grave, back before, well, before it all went wrong for her. "What was it precisely that went wrong, Amos?" Miss Marple asked, in the mild, unhurried tone she had perfected over a great many such conversations, the tone of a woman merely passing the time, rather than one drawing carefully toward the center of a matter she had turned over half the night in her mind. The old man's face closed, briefly, in the particular way village faces closed over old scandal, not from ignorance, but from a kind of protective loyalty to silence itself. "Not my place to say, Miss Marple, and that's the truth of it. There was talk, of course. There's always talk. Something about her situation at the big house. Mrs. Price's household this was, before the old lady died and the young Mr. Price took everything in hand. Alice was let go sudden-like, and within the year she was in the water. The lawyers came, and it was all settled very quiet and quick, and that was the end of it, far as the village was concerned. And was there? Miss Marple asked, watching a robin pick its way with brisk unconcern along the top of a neighboring stone. No child? She had not, in truth, expected an answer, had asked it more as one turns over a stone to see what lies beneath, without real hope of anything more than damp earth and a beetle or two, and so she was entirely unprepared for the way Amos Truan's weathered face changed, all at once, into something closer to sorrow than she had yet seen upon it. "Ah," he said, very quietly, and looked down at the grave again for a long moment before he spoke further. "So you've heard that whisper too, then. I never speak of it, mind, for it was told me in confidence by Nellie, who had it from the midwife over at Milchester, who's long since dead herself now. There was a child, Miss Marple, born some months before Alice died, sent away directly to relations up north, or so it was said, though I never knew for certain. A little girl, Nellie always believed, given a different name, raised never knowing, most like, whose child she truly was." He shook his head slowly. "Cruel business, all of it. Cruel to send a young woman off with nothing, cruel to send her child off after, and crueler still that the whole business should be forgotten so quick and so thorough, as though poor Alice had never drawn breath at all." Miss Marple sat very still upon the cold stone wall, feeling the weight of this settle into the same quiet, deepening place where the walking stick and the lavender-scented glove and the muddy smear upon the compartment step had all already lodged themselves, separate facts, still, but beginning, in the disciplined architecture of her mind, to arrange themselves into something with the unmistakable outline of a pattern. "You have been remarkably kind to her memory, Amos," she said at last gently. "I wonder that no one else in the village has troubled to be so." And it was here that the old sexton, straightening his cap and preparing to return to his leaves with the air of a man who felt he had already said rather more than he'd intended, offered, almost as an afterthought, in the careless, unweighted manner people use for the things that matter to them least, which are so often, Miss Marple had long observed, the very things that matter most, the remark that would not, in the days that followed, leave her mind for so much as an hour together. "Oh, I'm not the only one who remembers her, Miss Marple, whatever the rest of the village would have you believe. There was a young lady came round, 4 or 5 years back now, not long after she first took up at the post office, asked me the very same questions you're asking now, near enough word for word. Wanted to know where Alice was buried. Wanted to know about the household and the family and whether there'd been a child." He gave a small, unknowing shrug, already turning back to his leaves, entirely unaware of the stillness that had come over his listener. "Miss Hale, that was. Nice, quiet girl. Very particular about it all, I remember. wrote everything down in a little notebook, like she meant to remember every word. Chapter 5. The Suspects Gather. Inspector Craddock, whatever his private reservations about village atmosphere and the unreliability of gossip, was not a fool, and by the third day of his inquiry he had assembled, with the methodical thoroughness of a man building a wall one brick at a time, a small and uneasy gathering of individuals whose relationship to the late Edmund Price bore closer examination than the village had at first supposed. Miss Marple, who had not been invited to any of these interviews and would not have dreamed of suggesting she ought to be, nonetheless found herself in possession, by the end of that day, of a fairly complete account of each. Constable Palk being a young man of good nature and poor discretion, and the Blue Boar's saloon bar being, as it had always been, the truest intelligence service the village possessed. Major Rupert Ainsley, Price's former partner in the old firm of Price, Ainsley and Whitmore, arrived at the Blue Boar red-faced and blustering, in the manner of a man who has decided that indignation is the safest posture available to him. He had, it emerged under Craddock's patient questioning, quarreled bitterly with Price not 3 weeks previously, a matter, the Major admitted with visible reluctance, of some £400 advanced against the sale of a property that had never materialized, and which Price had begun, with characteristic and unbending precision, to demand repaid in full, in writing, with the cold correctness of a man calling in exactly what he was owed, and not a penny less. "Damned unpleasant business," the Major told Craddock, mopping his brow though the room was cool. "Man had no more warmth in him than a filing cabinet. But I never wished him dead, Inspector, whatever anyone tells you, and I was at my club in Milchester the whole of that evening, as a dozen men will swear to." It was, Miss Marple reflected upon hearing this account, precisely the sort of alibi that proved either everything or nothing. Clubs being notoriously accommodating institutions where a man's presence was noted with far more enthusiasm than his absence. But she noted, too, something in the reported manner of the Major's distress that struck her as belonging to guilt of a smaller, more familiar species. A man who has merely been cowardly about a debt does not generally have the nerve, whatever his grievances, to lure another man from a moving train. Diana Price presented a different, and in its way, a more affecting picture. The second Mrs. Price, some 20 years her late husband's junior, married to him a bare 4 years, and left now, as the village had already begun calculating with the particular avidity it reserved for such arithmetic, considerably better off than she had been, received Craddock in the drawing-room of the Price house with a composure that several observers found chilling, and that Miss Marple, hearing the account second-hand, found merely sad. "She didn't weep, Miss Marple," Constable Palk reported, with the faint disapproval of a young man who expected widows to perform their grief more visibly. "Sat there very upright, answering everything short and cool as you like. Inspector asked her outright whether the marriage was a happy one, and she said," here Palk consulted his notebook with some ceremony, she said, "It was what it was, Constable. I don't believe in pretending otherwise now that he can't correct me for it. It was, Miss Marple thought, when she heard the words repeated to her, not the answer of a guilty woman so much as the answer of an honest one who had long ago stopped expecting sympathy and had therefore ceased troubling to perform it, the particular, brittle dignity of someone who has grieved already, privately, for a marriage that died some years before the man in it did. But it was young Tom Whitfield, the signalman stationed at the box near Cardew Cutting, whose interview Craddock conducted last and found, by his own admission to Miss Marple, over a companionable half-hour the following morning, the most troubling of the three, not because the young man's answers implicated him in any obvious way, but because he could not, for all his evident effort, keep his hands from shaking, nor his eyes from sliding away toward the window each time the conversation drew near the hour of Price's disappearance. "But he's hiding something, Miss Marple," Craddock said, with the frustrated candor he permitted himself only in her cottage, over tea he had, by now, entirely stopped pretending not to want. "I'd stake my pension on it. But whatever it isn't murder. I've interviewed enough guilty men to know the difference, and this isn't guilt of that color. This is a young man frightened of something quite separate catching up with him." "Very possibly," Miss Marple agreed, refilling his cup with the unhurried competence of long practice. "Fear and guilt do wear remarkably similar faces, Inspector, and it takes a great deal of patience to tell them apart. I wonder, did you press him at all on the matter of the train schedule that evening? Whether it ran precisely to time?" It was, she would reflect afterward, a question asked almost idly, arising less from any settled suspicion than from the simple, ingrained habit of examining every stated fact for the small places where it might not quite fit its frame. And it was this question, relayed by Craddock to the young signalman in a second, sharper interview conducted that same afternoon, that finally broke through whatever careful composure Tom Whitfield had been maintaining. "He went very white," Polk reported afterward, quite unable to keep the drama from his voice, and for a long moment said nothing at all, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles showed pale. And then, in a rush, as though the words had been dammed up behind some private terror and had finally, unable to hold any longer, broken loose all at once. "The train did stop, sir. Just the once. Just for a minute. Perhaps a minute and a half. No more. Near the cutting, where the old maintenance halt is. It's not on any timetable. It's not meant to be used except for track men. And I never reported it because—" He stopped himself there, so abruptly and so completely that Craddock, leaning forward now with the sharp, focused attention of a hunter who has finally scented something real, pressed him twice more without result. Tom Whitfield would say nothing further, not why the train had stopped, not who had authorized it, not, above all, why a frightened young signalman would risk withholding evidence in a case of possible murder, rather than speak the reason aloud. And it was this silence, more than anything he had actually confessed, that lodged itself most firmly in Miss Marple's mind when Craddock relayed the exchange to her that evening. The silence of a young man who was afraid, she suspected, not of what he had done, but of whom he might be made to betray by telling the truth. Chapter 6. The Glove and the Ledger. The lavender water, as it turned out, took Miss Marple the better part of 2 days to place precisely, and it was a measure of her patience, a quality she had cultivated over a very long lifetime of small village puzzles, each one teaching her that haste was the surest way to overlook the single detail that mattered, that she did not trouble Inspector Craddock with her suspicion until she was entirely certain of it. It came to her in the end, not through any deliberate effort, but in the way such things so often did, while she was searching her own dressing table for a particular hat-pin. Her fingers closed instead upon a small, half-empty bottle of scent that had belonged to her Aunt Helen, dead now these 30 years, and the moment the stopper came free, and the old, sweet, faintly powdery fragrance rose up to meet her, she was seized by a memory so immediate and so complete that she sat down quite suddenly upon the edge of the bed. Carrington's, in Milchester High Street. A chemist's shop long since converted to a draper's that had sold in the years before the war a particular lavender toilette blended to their own recipe and favored, as she now recalled with growing clarity, by a very specific and dwindling clientele of ladies of a certain age and a certain gentility, the kind of scent a young woman of today would never dream of choosing, redolent as it was of dressing tables and antimacassars, and a world already passing when Miss Marple herself had been young. It was not, in short, the scent of a modern glove left carelessly upon a train seat by any ordinary passenger. It was, she thought, turning the little bottle over in her hands, the scent of someone who had either grown up around a woman of that vanished generation, or who had deliberately, and for reasons of her own, chosen to carry a little of that vanished world about with her, like a keepsake worn too close to be noticed by anyone but herself. She was still turning this thought over, with the unhurried thoroughness she brought to all such puzzles, when Craddock called upon her that same afternoon, considerably more animated than she had yet seen him, bearing news of his own. "We've been through Price's study at last, Miss Marple. His own solicitors had the safe open under the terms of the will, and there's a good deal in there that wants explaining. Diaries, mostly. The man kept a private one apart from his professional appointments. Small, leather thing, locked, full of the most extraordinary shorthand notations. Meetings he never told his clerk about. Sums of money that don't appear in any ledger I can find." He produced from his coat a slim black notebook, its pages closely covered in Price's small, precise hand, and opened it to a page he had marked with a strip of paper. "This is the entry that troubles me most, dated a fortnight before he died." Miss Marple took the diary and read, in Price's cramped and meticulous script, the single cryptic line Craddock had marked, "C.H. Thursday, the Fenwick papers." Must impress upon her the necessity of discretion, as before. She sat very still, holding the small book, aware of Craddock watching her, with the sharp attention of a man who had noticed, whatever his earlier skepticism, that his companion's stillness generally signified a great deal more than another person's exclamation might have done. "As before," she repeated softly, half to herself. "That is a very telling phrase, Inspector. It suggests Mr. Price believed he had secured someone's discretion once already, in some earlier matter, and required it again. It suggests, moreover, that whoever C.H. may be, Mr. Price did not regard her as an equal to be persuaded, but as a subordinate to be managed. She looked up. "Have you any notion who C.H. might be?" "None as yet," Craddock admitted. "Could be anyone. Half the county's got initials that'd fit, if you go looking hard enough." But Miss Marple, turning the diary gently in her hands, found that her mind, with the particular patient thoroughness it brought to such matters, sorting through faces and names and small remembered kindnesses, the way one sorts a basket of mixed buttons for a single matching pair, had already begun moving, almost against her own wishes, toward a name she did not want to arrive at. She thought of the post office, with its small, bright window full of stamps and string, and the particular orderly cheerfulness that seemed always to attend it. She thought of the young woman who kept it, quiet, capable, unfailingly kind, the sort of woman the whole village had long ago taken comfortably for granted. The way one takes for granted the reliability of the seasons, who had brought soup to old Mrs. Latimer through her influenza without being asked, who remembered every child's birthday and every widow's loneliest anniversary, who had, Miss Marple now recalled with a small, unwelcome jolt, initials that fit the diary's cryptic notation with an exactness that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Constance Hale. She had taken tea with Constance Hale on any number of pleasant afternoons. She had admired, quite genuinely, the young woman's needlework, her gentle patience with fractious children in the post office queue, her evident and unaffected goodness. And it was this, not the coincidence of initials alone, which might yet mean nothing, but the sudden, chilling recollection of Amos Trewin's careless remark in the churchyard only days before. Miss Hale, that was, nice, quiet girl, very particular about it all, that settled over Miss Marple now with the slow, cold weight of a realization she had not wanted to reach and could no longer honestly avoid. She set the diary down upon the table between them with great care, as though it were something that might, if handled roughly, do considerably more damage than it had already done, and looked up at Craddock with an expression he would later describe, in his report, as graver than he had ever yet seen upon her face. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder whether you have yet had occasion to ask Miss Hale of the post office anything at all about the late Mr. Price." Chapter 7. A Desk Sold at Auction. She did not go to Craddock with her suspicion fully formed, for it was not, she told herself firmly as she walked the short distance from her cottage to the post office the following morning, a suspicion at all as yet. Only a coincidence of initials, a fragrance half-remembered, an old sexton's careless recollection of a nameless young woman's visit years before. It would not do, she thought, to set the machinery of the law in motion against a woman she had liked, had, if she were honest with herself, liked very much indeed, on the strength of so little. And so, before speaking further to Craddock, she resolved to see for herself. She found, before she had gone even as far as the post office, a more immediate avenue of inquiry, in the form of the estate sale records for the old Fenwick house, which had been sold up, piece by piece, in the months following Alice's death, its contents scattered to whoever in the county cared to bid for them. These records, it transpired, were kept with the meticulous and slightly obsessive thoroughness of a man who had once been a solicitor's clerk himself, by old Mr. Endersby at the auction house in Milchester, and it was he who, upon Miss Marple's gentle and apparently idle inquiry, produced a ledger yellowed with age and turned, with surprising quickness for a man of his years, to the relevant page. "Curious you should ask, Miss Marple. I had occasion to look at this very entry myself not so very long ago. 3 or 4 years back it must have been, when a young lady came in asking after it. A writing desk, this was. Mahogany, rather a fine piece, though it went for a song, as most of that sale did. Nobody much wanted to be seen buying up the Fenwick things, not after all the talk." He ran a spotted finger down the column of faded ink until it stopped. "Here we are, sold to a Miss C. Hale, of this parish, paid in full, collected the same afternoon." Miss Marple thanked him with the composed, unhurried courtesy she brought to every encounter, and walked out into the gray Milchester street with the small, cold certainty settling further into place. No longer a coincidence now, but a pattern, and patterns, she had long ago learned, however much one might wish otherwise, very rarely lied. She called upon the post office that same afternoon, ostensibly for a book of stamps and a length of string, and found Constance Hale exactly as she always found her, neat, composed, unfailingly pleasant, moving about her small domain of pigeonholes and parcel scales with the quiet efficiency of a woman entirely at home in her own orderly world. And yet Miss Marple, watching now with the deliberate, patient attention she had trained upon so many faces over so many years, found herself noticing things she realized with some discomfort, noticed before without ever quite letting herself see them. The shop was too tidy, not merely clean, as any well-kept shop might be clean, but arranged with a precision that suggested something more than habit. Every ledger squared to the edge of the counter, every pen returned to its exact place, every stamp book stacked in descending order of denomination, as though disorder itself were a thing to be guarded against with unrelenting vigilance. It was, Miss Marple thought, the particular tidiness of a person who has learned, very early and very thoroughly, that control over small things is sometimes the only control available. "You're very quiet today, Miss Hale," she observed, in the mild conversational tone she used for such openings, watching the young woman's hands as she counted change with swift, practiced fingers. "I hope the dreadful business of poor Mr. Price hasn't distressed you unduly. It has cast such a shadow over the whole village." "It's a shocking thing, certainly," Constance said, and her voice, Miss Marple noted, was perfectly level, perfectly pleasant, and yet something in the careful evenness of it, the slight and deliberate slowness with which each word was chosen, struck her as the voice of someone reciting a sentence rehearsed rather than felt. "One doesn't like to think of such things happening here." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. though I find, the longer I live, that very little truly happens here that has not, in some fashion, been waiting a very long time to happen, brought to the surface at last by some small disturbance, the way an old stone works itself up through a field after a hard winter. She said it lightly, almost idly, watching all the while, and saw, or believed she saw, the faintest, swiftest flicker of something cross Constance Hale's composed face before it was smoothed away again, so quickly that a less practiced observer might have missed it entirely. It was as Constance reached up to a high shelf for a further book of stamps, her sleeve falling back with the small unconscious motion of the gesture, that Miss Marple's eye, trained by a lifetime's habit to miss nothing, however small, however seemingly insignificant, caught upon the narrow band of jewelry at the young woman's wrist, a thin, old-fashioned bracelet, its gold gone soft with age, bearing a single engraved letter, worn nearly smooth by years of handling, but still unmistakably legible. A, not C for Constance, not H for Hale. A. Miss Marple said nothing at all in that moment, merely accepted her stamps and her string and made her unhurried farewells with every appearance of a satisfied customer concluding an ordinary errand. But she walked home that evening along the lane by the churchyard wall with her heart considerably heavier than it had been that morning, turning over, with the sorrowful, methodical care of a woman assembling a truth she would very much have preferred not to find, the final small piece of a pattern that had now, she understood with complete and unwelcome certainty, arranged itself entirely into place. A writing desk from the Fenwick house, bought quietly by a young woman new to the village, a grave tended by no one but an old sexton, and one visitor who had come asking, years before, the very questions Miss Marple herself was only now beginning to ask. A scent too old-fashioned for any young woman to wear by choice, unless it carried with it the ghost of someone she had never been permitted to know. And now at the last a single engraved letter, worn soft with the particular tenderness of an object touched every day for years. Not the letter of the woman who wore it, but the letter, Miss Marple felt certain in the deepest and most sorrowful part of herself, of the mother she had lost before she had ever truly had her. Chapter 8. What the Timetable Knows. There remained, even now, one piece of the puzzle that Miss Marple had not yet fitted into place, not the who, which she felt, with a heaviness she did not trouble to examine too closely, she had already established, beyond any real doubt in her own mind, but the how. The precise, mechanical question of how a man might be persuaded to step from a moving train in fog and failing light and vanish so completely that even the guard who had seen him not 40 minutes before would swear to an empty compartment. It was Dr. Haydock, calling upon her that evening with the easy informality of an old friend rather than the professional briskness of a man attending a patient, who supplied, quite unwittingly, the final thread she required. "You've heard, I suppose, about the old maintenance halt near Cardew Cutting," he said, settling into the chair by her fire with the comfortable proprietorial air of a man who had occupied it many times before. "Extraordinary business." I had it from young Whitfield's father, who used to work the line himself years back. There's a signal stop out there, not on any public timetable, used only by the track gangs when they've work to do on the rails. A driver's meant to halt there only on a specific flag signal, shown by a trackman who has business to board or descend. Otherwise, the train sails straight past it without a second thought. Has done for 30 years, without incident so far as anyone remembers. And yet, Miss Marple said slowly, the train stopped there on the very evening Mr. Price vanished. So young Whitfield finally admitted, under considerable pressure, though he still won't say who showed the flag or why he never reported it. Haydock shook his head. Craddock's convinced the boy's protecting someone, a woman, if you ask me, from the particular shade of red he goes whenever it's mentioned. But that's neither here nor there to the mechanics of it. The point is, Miss Marple, that stop was no accident. Someone who understood that halt, someone with legitimate reason to know the signal, the flag, the precise timing of it, could have brought that train to a standstill in open country, in fog, for very nearly 2 minutes, with nobody any the wiser beyond the crew, who'd assume it mere track business and think no more of it. Miss Marple sat very still by her own small fire long after Dr. Haydock had taken his leave, turning this new fact over in her mind with the same patient, unhurried thoroughness she brought to a difficult piece of knitting, turning it, examining it from every angle, before permitting herself to draw the thread through. Who in St. Mary Mellow would possess an intimate working knowledge of such an obscure and unofficial stop? Not the general public timetable that hung in every station waiting room, but the private, technical rhythms of the line itself, the flag signals and maintenance schedules known chiefly to those whose daily work brought them into contact with the railway's inner workings. A signalman, certainly, a porter perhaps, or a station master. Or, she thought, with the same cold, sorrowful clarity that had settled over her in the post office 2 days before, a postmistress whose daily business it was to know precisely when the parcel post left and arrived, which trains ran late and which ran early, which stops were official, and which existed only in the private, practical knowledge passed between railway men who dealt with her, week upon week, over the counter of her small, tidy shop. A woman who might, over several years of quiet, patient, unremarkable industry, have come to know that stretch of line as intimately as she knew her own ledgers, and who might, further, have come to know a frightened young signalman well enough, and kindly enough, that he would sooner risk an inspector's suspicion than speak her name aloud. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a long moment, there in the firelight, and allowed herself, at last, the full and unwelcome shape of what she had been assembling, piece by careful piece, for the better part of a week. Edmund Price had not been abducted from that train, nor had he fallen from it by accident or by any struggle. He had stepped from it, willingly, unhurried, a careful man pausing to set his walking stick tidily against a willow before sitting down to what he believed would be a brief and private conversation, because someone he trusted, or believed he could manage, had arranged to meet him there, at that obscure and unofficial halt on some pretext connected, she felt certain, to the very matter his own diary had recorded in its cramped and secretive hand, the Fenwick papers. He had walked down that fog-wrapped footpath toward the mill pond, believing himself entirely in control of the situation, a man well accustomed to controlling situations, to managing the discretion of those less powerful than himself, and had discovered, too late for the discovery to save him, that the quiet, capable young woman waiting for him among the reeds was not there to be managed at all. It was, Miss Marple thought, rising at last and moving with slow, deliberate care to bank her fire for the night, one of the saddest patterns she had ever traced in a lifetime devoted to tracing such patterns, not the sudden, violent eruption of a stranger's malice, but the long, patient, silent accumulation of a grief that had been permitted no other outlet, no confession, no acknowledgment, for 2 decades and more, until it had finally, inevitably found the only voice left available to it. She did not sleep well that night, and toward morning, lying awake in the gray half-light with the church bell tolling some indeterminate hour, she reached the decision she had known. In some deeper part of herself, she would eventually have to reach. She would not go first to Inspector Craddock, with his notebooks and his warrants, and his brisk, necessary machinery of the law. She owed Constance Hale, or whatever her true name might once have been, before the village had known her only as the postmistress with the gentle hands and the tidy shop, one thing first, before the world closed in around her entirely. She owed her the chance to be heard, quietly, by someone who understood, before she was made to answer for what she had done to everyone else who never would. Chapter 9. Violets and Confession. She went to the post office at 6:30, when the shop had closed and the village had settled into that particular hush of early evening that fell over St. Mary Mellow in the colder months, when lamps were lit behind curtained windows and the lanes stood empty, save for the occasional hurrying figure bent against the wind. She had sent no word ahead, and she carried nothing with her but her umbrella and the quiet, settled resolve of a woman who had made up her mind to a difficult task and did not intend to falter in its performance. Constance Hale answered the side door herself, and if she was surprised to find Miss Marple upon her step at such an hour, she gave no immediate sign of it beyond a small, careful stillness about the eyes. The stillness, Miss Marple thought, of someone who has spent a very long time schooling her face not to betray her, and who is beginning at last to feel that discipline failing her. "Miss Marple, won't you come in out of the cold?" The back room of the post office, where the counting was done and the accounts kept, was smaller and plainer than the shop itself, lit by a single lamp, warmed by a modest fire that had burned down to embers. Constance did not offer tea, and Miss Marple did not ask for any. They sat instead in the small, close silence of 2 women who both understood, without either having yet said so, that the conversation about to take place was not one for the ordinary courtesies. "I have come," Miss Marple said at last, gently, "because I believe you already know why I have come, my dear, and I did not think it kind to make you wait upon it any longer than necessary." Constance's hands, folded in her lap, tightened very slightly, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, looking not at Miss Marple, but into the dying fire, her face, in the low lamplight, suddenly and unmistakably younger than Miss Marple had ever seen it, stripped, for the first time, of the careful composure she had worn like a well-fitted coat for as long as the village had known her. "You know, then," she said at last. It was not a question. "I know a great deal, I think, though I should be glad to hear it from you, rather than assemble it entirely from glove and scent and an old sexton's memory. I know that your mother was Alice Fenwick, and that you have carried her memory, and I think her grief, for a very long time, and largely alone." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle throughout, without a trace of accusation in it, and it was this gentleness, more than any sterner approach could have achieved, that seemed at last to loosen something in the younger woman that had been held rigid for years. "I found her letters," Constance said, so quietly Miss Marple had to lean forward to catch it, "in the desk, the one I bought at the sale. I didn't even know at first whose it had been, only that it was cheap and I needed a desk. It was months before I found the false bottom in the second drawer. Months before I understood what I was reading." Her hands, still folded, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. She wrote to her sister, the aunt who raised me, who never once told me the truth of it, not until she was dying, and the guilt of it finally overcame her. My mother wrote about the household, about Mrs. Price, about a young man she trusted who drew up papers she didn't fully understand, papers that took everything from her, her position, her reputation, her child, in exchange for a silence she was never in any position to refuse. She wrote about how alone she was, how frightened, how no one would receive her once it was known. And then the letters simply stopped, Miss Marple. They simply stopped in the autumn of 1930, and I know now why. And Edmund Price, Miss Marple said softly, was the young man who drew up those papers. He never even remembered her. Constance's voice, when it came, carried a depth of quiet, controlled fury that was, Miss Marple thought, far more disturbing than any outburst could have been. That was the thing I could not forgive, in the end. Not even the cruelty of what he'd done, but the smallness of it to him. I came to the village meaning only to learn the truth, to see where she was buried, to understand what had happened to the mother I never knew. I never meant. I want you to believe that, Miss Marple. Whatever else you believe of me, I never meant, at first, to do anything more than know. And then, Constance closed her eyes. And then he came into the post office some 6 weeks ago, quite ordinary, quite pleasant, exactly as he always was. And he asked me, in that careful, correct way of his, whether I might be trusted to hold certain parish records privately for him, records concerning a young woman presently in his employ who had gotten herself, as he put it, into difficulty, and whom he intended to manage quietly, as he had always managed such things quietly. He used almost the very same words my mother had written in her letters, almost the very same phrase. Her eyes opened, and they were bright now with tears she made no effort to hide. I understood, in that moment, that nothing had changed at all, that he would go on and on doing exactly what he had done to her, to some other frightened girl, and then another after that, forever, because no one had ever once made him answer for it, because the village had let it be buried, the way it let everything be buried, so long as it was buried quietly. The confession, when it came at last, came not in a rush, but slowly, almost gently, as though Constance were setting down, one by careful one, burdens she had carried so long she scarcely remembered how to hold them any longer. The forged note in Price's own careful hand, copied from years of steaming open his correspondence at the sub-post office. The arranged signal at the old maintenance halt, timed with the precision of a woman who knew every rhythm of that line. The walk down the fog-wrapped footpath beside a man who believed, until the very last moment, that he was walking toward nothing more than a discreet and manageable conversation. "I did not plan it, Miss Marple. Not really. Not until that very evening. I only meant to speak to him. I meant to ask him at last to account for what he had done. And when he stood there, by the water, and could not even properly remember her name, when he called her the Fenwick girl, as though she had never been anything more to him than a line in a ledger, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. It was at that moment, as the last of the fire's embers settled with a small, soft collapse into ash, that the beam of headlights swept suddenly across the curtained window, sharp and white and entirely unmistakable, and both women turned, in the same instant, toward the sound of a car drawing to a halt in the lane outside. Inspector Craddock's car, Miss Marple knew without needing to look, arrived at last upon the same trail she herself had followed, some hours behind, but following none the less. Constance rose very slowly, and there was in her face, as she turned toward the window, not fear exactly, but something quieter and more terrible than fear, the calm, almost peaceful acceptance of a woman who has carried a weight so long that its setting down, however dreadful the circumstances, comes almost as a mercy. "Miss Marple," she said, and her voice was steady now, steadier than it had been throughout the whole of her confession. "Will you do one thing for me, whatever happens now? Will you see that someone tends her grave properly, with her name said aloud, now and again, by someone who knows the truth of who she was? She had no one to do that for her all these years. I should like to think she might have that much, now at least." And Miss Marple, rising to meet whatever was about to come through that door, reached out and took the younger woman's cold hand in her own and promised her that she would. Chapter 10. The late train home. Inspector Craddock, when he came through the door of that small back room not 2 minutes later, found the scene already arranged for him with a stillness that seemed, he would say afterward, more like the aftermath of a storm than its beginning. Constance Hale, standing quite composed beside the dying fire, her hands folded before her in the manner of a woman waiting, without protest, for something she had long known must eventually arrive, and Miss Marple seated near her, upright and grave, her umbrella still resting against her knee, exactly where she had placed it upon entering, as though she had known even then that she would not be permitted to leave again quickly. "I think, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, before Craddock had found the words for whatever he had come prepared to say, "that Miss Hale has something she wishes to tell you. I would ask only that you hear her out gently. She has carried a very great deal for a very long time, and I do not believe there is anything left in her now but the truth." Craddock, to his credit, did exactly that. He was, whatever his earlier impatience with village atmosphere, a fundamentally decent man, and something in the quiet dignity of the young woman before him, so unlike the wild-eyed guilt he had half expected to find, had he found her at all, checked whatever briskness he might otherwise have brought to the moment. He took down her statement there, in that small, firelit room, with Miss Marple sitting silently beside her the whole while, neither prompting nor interrupting, only present, as a woman might sit beside a friend in illness, offering nothing but the simple, steadying fact of not being alone. Constance told it all again, more precisely this time, for the record rather than for absolution. The forged note, copied with painstaking care from letters she had steamed open at the sub-post office over years of quiet, patient study of Price's hand. The arranged signal at the maintenance halt, its flag shone at the precise moment she had calculated from a timetable she knew as intimately as her own pulse. The walk beside him down the fog-bound footpath in the last dusk toward the water where her mother had drowned 2 decades before. She did not weep as she spoke. She did not, Craddock noted in his report, with something approaching wonder, attempt once to soften what she had done, nor to excuse it beyond the bare, terrible facts of why. She was arrested a little before 8 o'clock and led out to the waiting car with a composure that unsettled the small handful of villagers who had gathered, drawn by rumor and lamplight, at the end of the lane, a composure that would be spoken of in St. Mary Mellow for years afterward, not as coldness, but as something closer to relief. The days that followed were, for the village, days of a peculiar and uncomfortable reckoning. It was one thing, Miss Marple reflected, walking her familiar lanes in the gray November mornings that followed, for a village to absorb a murder committed by a stranger, some outside malevolence intruding briefly upon its settled order before departing again, leaving the fabric of daily life essentially undisturbed. It was quite another thing to absorb a murder committed by one of their own most gentle and trusted members, for reasons that reached back into a silence the village itself had helped to keep. Mrs. Thorne came to tea a week later, considerably subdued from her earlier animation, and admitted, turning her cup round and round in her hands, that she had known Alice Fenwick's story vaguely, in the way one knows an old scandal, and had never once, in all the years since, thought to ask what had become of the child. "None of us did, Miss Marple," she said, with the particular unhappiness of a fundamentally kind woman confronting her own small failure of imagination. "We let it be buried, because burying it was easier than asking who might still be living with the wound of it. I wonder how many other Alices there have been, in how many other villages, quietly folded away because it was more comfortable for everyone else to forget. I have wondered the same thing myself, my dear, more than once," Miss Marple replied. It is, I think, one of the great and quiet cruelties of village life, that our very kindness to one another so often depends upon a collective agreement not to look too closely at what has been swept beneath the hearthrug. We are none of us as innocent in these matters as we would like to believe. Inspector Craddock, calling upon her a final time before the case passed formally into the hands of the courts, sat rather longer than his tea required, turning his cup in his hands with the particular restlessness of a man troubled by a case even after its solving. "I keep thinking," he admitted at last, "that if it had been anyone else, if she'd been the sort of woman one could point to and say, 'Yes, there, that's a killer's face,' I shouldn't feel half so unsettled by it. But she wasn't. She was kind, Miss Marple, genuinely kind, by every account I've gathered. Sat up 3 nights running with old Mrs. Latimer when she had the influenza. Never took a penny extra from anyone who couldn't afford the postage. How does a woman like that come to lure a man to his death with a forged letter and a stolen railway signal?" Miss Marple considered the question with the gravity it deserved, folding her hands in her lap and looking, for a moment, not at Craddock, but into some middle distance that seemed to hold, for her, the accumulated weight of a very long observation of human nature. "I think, Inspector, that we make a grave error when we imagine goodness and violence to be opposites, each excluding the other, as though a person must be sorted once and finally into one category or the other. What I have learned, in a great many years of watching people in this village and others like it, is that kindness and rage can live very comfortably in the same heart, quite unknown to each other, so long as nothing occurs to bring them into contact. Constance Hale's kindness was entirely genuine. I do not doubt that for a moment, and I do not think you should either. But beneath it, unattended for over 20 years, there lived a grief that had never once been permitted to speak its name aloud, never comforted, never even acknowledged by the very people who might have eased it, simply because acknowledging it would have required them to admit an old and comfortable wrong. Grief of that kind does not disappear merely because it goes unspoken, Inspector. It only waits, and when Mr. Price, of all people, stood before her and could not even properly recall her mother's name, when he reduced a woman's entire ruined life to a line in a ledger, precisely as he had once reduced her to a piece of business requiring discreet management, I believe something in Constance simply could not bear the weight of that final, casual cruelty any longer. It was not planned from the beginning, I think, whatever the careful mechanics of the ending might suggest. It was, in the truest sense, a life's accumulated silence finally breaking. "That doesn't make it right," Craddock said, though without much force behind it. "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "It does not make it right. Nothing makes the taking of a life right, Inspector, and I would not wish you to imagine I excuse it, for I do not. But I have found, over a great many years, that understanding a thing and excusing it are not at all the same exercise, and that justice, true justice, not merely the satisfaction of punishment, requires us to hold both truths at once, that Constance Hale did a terrible wrong, and that a far older, quieter wrong was done to her mother first, and to her, and was never once answered for by anyone until she answered for it herself, in the only language left available to her. She visited Constance once more before the trial, in the plain, cold visiting room of the county jail, carrying with her a small bunch of violets bought that morning from the flower stall in Milchester Market. Violets being, as she had learned from Alice Fenwick's own letters, carefully transcribed now into the evidence file but shown to her in a moment of private kindness by Craddock himself, the flower Alice had loved best, had grown along the cottage wall of her childhood home, had pressed, in one particularly affecting passage, between the pages of a Bible she had hoped one day to give her daughter. Constance received the flowers with a composure that had not left her even now, though something in her eyes, when she looked up from them, carried a gratitude too large for words. "You didn't have to come," she said. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but I wished to. I promised you I would see your mother's grave properly tended, and I have already spoken to Amos Trewin about fresh flowers each season, and to the vicar about a small stone to mark at last that she was loved and remembered by her own daughter, whatever else the world chose to forget of her. I thought you should know that promise is being kept, whatever else lies ahead of you now." Constance's composure broke then, at last, quietly and without drama, tears sliding down her face as she pressed the violets to her chest with both hands, and Miss Marple sat with her in that cold room for a long while afterward, saying very little, offering only the steady, undemanding presence of someone who had judged her honestly and had not, for all that, withdrawn her compassion. It was some weeks later, on an evening much like the one that had begun this whole sorrowful business, that Miss Marple found herself once again upon the platform of St. Mary Mellow Station, waiting for the evening train, not this time for any parcel, but simply, she admitted to herself with the honesty she brought to all her private reckonings, because she had felt a need to ride that stretch of line once more, past Cardew Cutting, past the old maintenance halt with its silent, unmarked signal, past the willow where a walking stick had once stood so carefully, so trustingly propped against the bark. Dr. Haydock had offered to accompany her, and the two of them sat together in a first-class compartment as the fog gathered once more over the water meadows, the lamps glowing amber against the deepening dusk, exactly as they had glowed on that first fateful evening. And Miss Marple looked out at the passing dark with the particular stillness of a woman turning a long sorrow over in her mind for one final time before setting it down. "You solved it, in the end," Haydock said, watching her profile against the window glass, "though I confess I still don't entirely understand how you arrived where you did, from a glove and a scent and an old man's memory." "I did not solve it so much as I listened, Doctor, to the village, to its silences quite as much as to its speech. A place like ours keeps its truths the way an old house keeps its draughts, hidden behind paneling, forgotten until a cold wind finds the gap and reminds you it was always there. Edmund Price believed, I think, that Alice Fenwick's silence had been purchased once and for all, that money and careful paperwork could close a matter permanently, the way one closes a ledger and moves on to the next account. He never understood, men of his particular careful cruelty rarely do, that grief compounds rather than resolves when it is left unaddressed, and that a debt of that kind, however quietly it is buried, does not vanish. It only waits for someone, someday, to come and collect it. The train rattled on through the gathering dark, past the black shape of the mill pond just visible through the fog, its willows bending low over water that had claimed, now, 2 lives across 2 generations, and Miss Marple watched it recede behind them with an expression Dr. Haydock, glancing at her, found he could not quite name, not triumph certainly, at a mystery solved, but something graver and more tender, the particular sorrow of a woman who understood, better than most, that the truth, once uncovered, so rarely brings the relief one hopes for, and brings instead only the quiet, necessary weight of having finally seen a thing clearly for what it always was. "There is no great mystery left in it now, I think," she said at last, softly, as the lights of St. Mary Mellow Station began to glimmer ahead of them through the fog, orderly and lit and expectant, precisely as they had been on that first terrible evening. "Only an old, sad story of the kind that has played itself out, in one form or another, in 100 villages very like our own, of silence mistaken for peace, and cruelty mistaken for order, and a young woman's whole life quietly erased because it was more convenient for everyone else that it should be. Constance did a wicked thing, Doctor, and she will answer for it, as she must. But I confess I find myself unable to think of her, even now, as simply wicked, only as someone who waited a very long time to be heard, and was heard, in the end, far too late, and by no one who could have prevented what that long silence finally became. The train drew into the station with its familiar, gentle sigh of brakes, every window glowing, every compartment, this time accounted for, and Miss Marple rose, gathering her umbrella and her shawl with the same unhurried composure with which she had begun this long and sorrowful inquiry, stepping down at last onto the platform where it had all first begun, into the cold and settling dark of a village that would carry, from now on, its ghosts a little more openly than it had before. And perhaps, she thought, walking home through the quiet lanes toward her own lit window, that was itself a kind of justice, not the justice of courts and verdicts alone, but the harder, humbler justice of a place finally willing to remember what it had once found it easier to forget.